Deputy Prime Minister, ministers and distinguished guests. I'm pleased to be here today at this important forum and to share my perspective. I've been asked to speak on a big topic, so I will structure my presentation in 5 parts. Firstly, to give a brief overview of Australia's experience with economic reform, including the domestic institutions and policy frameworks developed to help the Australian economy reach its productive potential. Secondly, to outline the current trade policy context. Third, to look at the current status of mega regional FTAs and regional economic integration. Fourth, to look at the nature of new generation FTAs. And finally, examine some key issues relating to CPTPP implementation and institutional reform in Vietnam. From the early 1950s to 1990, Australia was in a period of relative economic decline. We were going down. Australia's economy at that time was characterised by national development, which involved high protective trade barriers and development of economic infrastructure through state-owned enterprises. This slide, oh sorry, I've jumped one. Don't know what's happened here. But this slide illustrates Australia's decline in productivity among OECD countries. Australia went from having the 4th highest per capita GDP in 1950 to 14th in 1983. The world, or at least the rest of the world, or most of it, was reforming, and Australia was not keeping up. It was increasingly recognised in the early 1980s that the Australian market was not competitive domestically, and unless and until it was, it could not compete internationally. That sentiment was captured by the warning from the then Australian Treasurer, Paul Keating, in May 1986, which I remember very well, him saying that Australia risked becoming a third-rate economy, a banana republic, if we did not undertake serious reforms. The 1980s and 1990s saw gradual trade and economic reform aimed at avoiding future boom-bust cycles by having a more flexible and sustainable domestic economy and more open international markets. This involved a series of reforms directed at opening the economy to international competition, improving the institutional and regulatory framework to provide greater flexibility in the use of resources, and improving the efficiency of infrastructure and public utility services. Specific domestic reforms included floating of the Australian dollar and removal of interest rate controls, lowering of the tax rate and broadening the tax base, structural separation and privatisation of SOEs, competitive neutrality, third-party access in monopoly infrastructure, the reduction of tariffs and removal of quantitative import restrictions. Such unilateral trade reforms were presented internationally as a down payment in the 1986-1994 GATT-Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations. Australia weathered the 1997-98 East Asian financial crisis in large part because of the domestic reforms implemented during the 1980s and 1990s, which enabled the Australian economy to adjust flexibly to external shocks and changes to economic conditions. More recently, in the last decade, Australia has experienced a high turnover of Prime Minister and ministers than we have previously experienced. Prime Minister Morrison is now Australia's 6th Prime Minister in 11 years, and we're going to have another election in a few months' time. However, it was principally the reforms undertaken in the 1980s and 1990s and the performance of our public institutions that have helped Australia to grow and develop. My presentation today is not on the opportunities and challenges for Australia, but I would note in passing that one of Australia's challenges at the moment is to inject new reform momentum. There is an important role for political leaders to provide the leadership, a coherent vision about the future that brings their people along with them, and to make the investments necessary to maintain and invigorate the institutions. Notwithstanding Australia's record of 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth, it has not always been smooth, and there have been some bumps on the road, and there are things that could have been done better. Generally, Australia's institutions have been working well, but there are a number of areas which have been under-resourced and perhaps not had sufficient leadership and direction. Australia has a culture of transparent processes for examining successes and failures, which are supported by our institutions such as the Productivity Commission and Royal Commissions that undertake public inquiries. Outcomes of such processes enable governments to make informed decisions and adjust accordingly. For example, Australia has a Banking Royal Commission underway at the moment, which is expected to make recommendations including on strengthening the resources of Australia's financial regulatory authorities. Previous speakers have given very good presentations on the current trade policy context, so I just won't repeat this and I won't go through these points, except, of course, I agree there are many uncertainties. And to draw your attention to the third point, that most countries are doing what they can to increase confidence in the external policy environment and to strengthen their ability to withstand externally generated shocks. That is the general context that has seen the emergence of bilateral and regional FTAs, and in recent years, a major focus on the mega-regional and new generation FTAs. I'm sorry, I've just been given a note saying I've got 2 minutes more. I think I've only been speaking for about 8 minutes, but maybe if I could have 5 minutes, I'll try and make these points. I just thought the context was important. I won't go through this, except to note this is the current status of the main mega-regional FTAs, and some of them are more mega than others. And what I do want to highlight is the TPP, which can't proceed at this stage, but is moving forward without the US through the CPTPP, which will enter into force on 30 December this year. Now, this is just a Venn diagram that shows you the overlapping memberships of the various regional economic integration initiatives. There's a lot going on. What I find very interesting in this diagram is where Vietnam is positioned. I'll just note that. It's very interesting. I don't have time to go through this now, but happy to discuss it with others after. Let's move on in terms of new generation FTAs. What we have seen over the past decade is international economic engagement getting broader and deeper, with an increasing focus on issues behind the border. New generation FTAs strengthen the legislative framework for trade through WTO plus market access commitments and WTO plus rules that address a broad range of behind-the-border concerns raised by businesses, such as non-tariff measures, services integration and investment policies, where business has expressed concerns about a lack of transparency and good coordination within government and a failure to strengthen the rule of law and address corruption, particularly in a number of emerging and developing economies. These issues are relevant to the operation of supply chains and international production networks and are not confined to goods, as World Bank previously outlined. They also encompass services, investment, intellectual property, competition and other issues which can all act as disincentives to businesses seeking to develop value chains. For example, eliminating tariffs or eliminating foreign investment restrictions in a services sector may not have a significant impact if there are other regulatory measures that limit competition or impose additional costs for value chain businesses. I should note at the outset I made a little mistake here. I think the correct date for Vietnam is 14 January, not 19 January. But anyway, it's pretty close in terms of CPTPP entering into force for Vietnam. During my former life as an Australian government trade official for 40 years, 4 decades, I was involved in negotiating and implementing a number of trade agreements. The key lesson I learnt from that experience was that effectively implementing trade agreements can be as challenging, if not more challenging, than negotiating them. The benefits of these agreements do not automatically happen. Governments need to be active with the implementation agenda, domestically and internationally with other parties. Otherwise, there is a very real risk that expected benefits will not be realised because of poor implementation. Implementation is a major undertaking, and leadership and commitment to effective institutional arrangements and good coordination are required. Otherwise, CPTPP will not become a path-breaking living agreement. The fact that new generation FTAs address behind-the-border issues means that these FTAs, such as CPTPP, are going to be engaging more deeply with internal policy reform. In areas such as regulatory coherence, competition and state-owned enterprises, transparency and anti-corruption, labour and environment. This does present a challenge as it essentially injects the international dimension into domestic policy processes and thereby broadens the institutionalisation of domestic policy processes. Many of the issues are cross-cutting across various government agencies, and good and effective internal coordination will therefore be required. Just in the interest of time, I'll be very brief here just to note that cooperation is a very important part of the equation here, and we have a chapter in CPTPP, and this slide shows you a number of examples of other chapters that have provisions recognising the importance of cooperation to support implementation of these chapters. To be effective, a disciplined and carefully coordinated and planned approach will be required, including identifying the gaps in cooperation already being provided through other mechanisms. For example, I'm very familiar with the Competition Law Implementation Program implemented under the ASEAN Australia-New Zealand FTA. Institutional arrangements are also an opportunity to learn from shared implementation experiences. Engaging in the work of relevant committees provides opportunities for institutional linkages and ongoing engagement. A proactive approach also provides the opportunity to shape relevant agendas to support internal reform. I was surprised when I had a good look at the CPTPP just to discover how many committees will be meeting within the first year of entry into force, and that's just a list of them. All those meetings are going to take place in 2019. My final slide. My father used to say, If a job is worth doing, it is worth doing well. I believe that principle applies to FTA implementation and internal reform. My key concluding message is effective implementation requires leadership and good intergovernmental coordination to manage the reform process, including building the quality of domestic institutions as part of a longer-term strategic vision and process. Each country is different, and it is up to each country to determine its own way forward for the long term. CPTPP commitments could provide an anchor for reforms which must be multi-year and strategically focused to be successful. Importantly, I'd suggest please do not limit yourselves or your mindsets to just achieving minimum requirements under new generation FTAs, but rather to look at opportunities to use these benchmarks to adopt best practice. I won't make you can read the point about effective cooperation, and this is my final. Experience from Australia and many other countries indicate that it is important to proceed on a step-by-step basis, but with a strong sense of the longer-term direction, clearly driving the process and with a commitment to maintain the reform process over the longer term. Good transparency and constructive engagement with the private sector and other stakeholders is essential to successful reform to ensure the private sector understands the new opportunities and feels sufficiently engaged to be able to seize these opportunities to make them work. Thank you very much.